there's an interesting struggle that we face. When I mean we, I'm talking about Christians, but I will admit that I guess everybody probably faces this. And it comes down to having to make the right decision when someone is in need of help. We all face this challenge. If we're not selfish, then we typically would like to help others. But then we realize that you can't always help, and sometimes you want to help and realize you probably shouldn't have helped. And so we face a lot of challenges in this area. But what is interesting, and you think about the scripture reading that was read earlier at the start of the lesson, one of the things, and it's interesting, that when in the judgment scene that is painted there, one of the things that is really highlighted is whether or not we've been willing to help others. Now, it doesn't mean that that excludes everything else from being important. Obviously, it doesn't. But I think overall selflessness is a very important factor, because while it keeps us obedient to God, it also keeps us with a proper mindset towards others. And so this morning what I'd like to do is talk about the subject of helping others. And what does the Bible teach? What is our responsibility when it comes to this particular subject? Now, when you study the Bible, you find that there have been individuals in the past who did not like to help people. They were very stingy with what they had. They were very selfish with what they had. The case in point is a man by the name of Nabal in 1 Samuel 25, verses 5 through 13. David and his men came to Nabal's his land and his household, and they were in need of nutrition, and so they asked Nabal for it. Nabal says no, refused to help them whatsoever. Very selfish, very stingy. And in the story, if you go on and read all of the story there, you find that his wife wasn't that way. And she also knew what would happen with the wrath of David upon the household for her husband being so stingy and selfish. So she stepped forward and made the provisions available to David and his men. Another interesting case in point where we see an unwillingness to help others. Turn with me to Ezekiel chapter 16. Many times when we talk about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, there are other sins of Sodom and Gomorrah that clearly come to mind. The sexual immorality that was prevalent within that city. But in Ezekiel chapter 16, the writer here identifies that there was more problems that existed there within Sodom. And notice what it says, Ezekiel chapter 16. Let's look at verses 49 and 50. He says, "Look, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughter had pride, fullness of food, and abundance of vitalness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy, and they were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw fit." So it's interesting there when you read about the story of Sodom, that there's more to that. And part of it was their selfishness, their unwillingness to help those who were in need. And as we read in the scripture reading, Matthew 25, 41 through 46, within the context there, Jesus talks about the same type of people. Now, before we begin with the lesson, I want to stress again that there are certain challenges that come into play. And there are certain people that you should not help. And there are certain people who genuinely are in need of help. And you got to somehow or another balance the two of them. I say that because in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, in the case in point there, you had some members of the church who were going about busybodies. They were idle. They were refusing to work. And so Paul says, if a man doesn't work, neither shall he eat. So, if you look at a case in point, we've got someone who's too lazy to work, and they come and say, give me food, I'm hungry. That's not really the person you should help, because they have rejected their God-given responsibility of doing what they can to provide for themselves. When you think about, for instance, in the sermon or the prayer that Jesus kind of used as an example, said, "Father, give us this day our daily bread." We pray to God for our daily necessities within life, but that doesn't absolve us from the responsibility of working for these things. And then Paul, in his letter to the church at Ephesus, in Ephesians chapter 4, he makes the point, he says, those who have stolen, let him steal no more, but rather let him labor with his hands working, so he may have to give to those who are in need. So there's definite precedence within the Bible that shows the people of God bore responsibility as much as they could to be able to help those who are in need. One more point. When you look at the fall of the northern nation of Israel and then subsequently the fall of Judah, you study the writings of the minor prophets and the prophets, you find that part of their downfall was the way they treated those who had less, the way that they treated those who were without, the way they treated the widows and the orphans. They didn't have any special governmental programs to step up. And so if they abused them, if they selfishly held on to their money and didn't help them and they took advantage of them, the Lord did not look favorably upon that. We must have a willingness to help those who were in need. This fundamentally is God's desire for us. Notice in Matthew chapter 25, now let's look at verses 34 through 36. Focus on this again. So you have the king, he'll say to those on his right hand, "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." So he says, the kingdom has been prepared for you from the foundation of the world. In our adult class out here, we're studying essentially the scheme of redemption. And I know in the back adult class as well, they're studying the same study as well, or the same topic. And in both those cases there, you see that God had a plan for man from the very beginning. And this is part of it, kind of the reference there he references it. "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." And then he says, and these are the ones who would inherit the kingdom. "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me." And what about that? That's an interesting thing that Christ would use to say this is what you need to do to enter into the kingdom. Now, it's not the only thing, obviously. We recognize that. But for the context of what Jesus is dealing with, it is incredibly important. It is God's desire that if we have the ability to help, that we take that ability to help. I mean, great. If you think about the greatest of examples, think about Jesus. I mean, Jesus did not come bringing bountiful wealth. He didn't come to cure the hunger problem of the world. He didn't come to take away poverty of the world. He came to do one thing, and that is to save man from his sins. And Jesus, in 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 through 17, he was willing to give it all. He shed his blood upon that cross of Calvary. He gave his life to provide what we were in need of. Look at verses 16 and 17 of 1 John 3. "By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us," he says. "And we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him?" God sent Jesus to die for our need. Jesus willingly came to die for our need. And here my brother's in need, and I have what he has need of, and my heart is cold and closed up, and I'm unwilling to help him. How could I possibly be that way knowing what God has done for me? That's kind of the point there that John is making. There's got to be the willingness to even give our life if necessary. There's got to be the willingness there to help, this hospitality. And it needs to be shown without grumbling. Notice with me in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 9. You can do a lot of nice things, and you can grumble about it all day long. And it kind of almost negates the very thing that you're doing. In 1 Peter chapter 3, note with me there, or 1 Peter 4, verse 9, he says there, "Be hospitable to one another without grumbling." In other words, he's talking about the willingness to help, the willingness to be able to to extend to others what they have need of. Sometimes we think about the word hospitality as kind of this idea of, well, I'll always open my house up. Whoever, we have a lot of people over to our house, so we're very hospitable. But the idea of hospitality is really the idea of providing what is in need. The ability to step up when you have what someone else is in need of and helping to provide for their need. It's really the true sense there of this idea of hospitality. And he says to do it without grumbling. If someone is in need of something or another and they come, a brother comes to you and says, hey, can you help me with this? And in the back of your mind saying, I wish he had gone to another brother. I wish he hadn't come to my house. I wish this, I wish that, I really don't want to do it. And in your whole mind, you're yelling at yourself, run away, I don't want to help. And then with your mouth, you're saying, here, take what you need. That's not what Peter's talking about. We need to be willing to have this willingness to help without grumbling. It is based upon a compassion that we are to have for one another. Look in the same book, 1 Peter, chapter 3 now, verses 8 and 9. He says, finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another. Then he says, love as brothers. He says, be tenderhearted. He says, be courteous. And then he says, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing. Know that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. We were called to this as the children of God so that we may inherit a blessing. But we are called by God to behave in this fashion where we are compassionate, where we have this love, where we are tenderhearted, where we are courteous. We don't return evil for evil, but instead will return blessings for evil. This was the example that Jesus set for us when he died upon the cross. Jesus was persecuted, he suffered, but yet he never did leave the goal that God had given him. He always remained holy. And that is the example that we are supposed to follow. It's a willingness to help. Let's talk about this willingness, though, on an individual level. When I mean individual level, I'm talking about when we're not working as a collective group here, when you go home to your house, you go to your work, you go to your jobs, you go to school. That is what we're talking about now. We're talking about individual application. How does this really impact us? What does the Bible teach on this? Well, an interesting case in point that Jesus uses to illustrate who truly is your neighbor is found in Luke chapter 10. We normally call this the Good Samaritan, and there's a reason for this. Luke chapter 10, you had this Samaritan who's walking on the road. And you'll notice there that he comes across an individual who had been attacked. He's on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he found a certain man there, a Jew, that had been attacked by thieves. He had been stripped of his clothes, he's wounded, and they left him half dead. So verse 31. Now by chance a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by the other way. Priests were supposed to have known the law of God. And they were required, they knew the law would have required them to help that man, but they walked on the other side of the road. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at that place, came and looked and passed by on the other side. Two people who should have understood the responsibilities chose to ignore the responsibility. And can you imagine someone doing that? Can you imagine someone walking along the road and they see someone laying there half dead and say, oh, look at the pretty tree over there on that side of the road. Look at over there. Don't worry about that over there. Let's look over here. So, verse 33, a certain Samaritan. Samaritans were considered, pardon the expression, but this is kind of the idea, they were considered half-breeds effectively by the Jews. The Jews were very, very prejudicial against the Samaritans because the Samaritans, they got their start, if you would, when the northern nation of Israel was carried off into captivity. The Assyrians, what they would do, it was they would leave a few of the Israelites behind, and they would take the rest and to their territories and scatter them, and they would bring foreigners that they'd captured from other lands into the land of Israel, the captive land, and there was a lot of intermarrying going on. All right, these became known as the Samaritans because the capital of the northern nation of Israel became to be Samaria. And so the Samaritans were the reminders of the Jews of a bad time. And so the Jews detested the Samaritans. This is why it was so shocking that Jesus would talk to the woman at the well, because she was a Samaritan and he was a Jew. And so here we have the Samaritan. If anybody's going to say, look at that guy over there, I'm glad he got what was coming to him, it'd been the Samaritan. And so that's why the illustration, the example here becomes all the more important. Because someone who you would not have expected to have stepped up to the responsibility did. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. The priest did not have compassion. The Levite did not have compassion. The Samaritan had the compassion. So he takes him, he bandages his wounds, he pours on oil and wine. It's kind of the way of treating what had happened to the gentleman, taking care of him. He set him on his own animal, took him to the inn, told them to take care of him, and that he would continue to pay for whatever was needed. Now, Jesus says to the question, who is my neighbor? Love your neighbor as yourself. It's the person who is in need. It is the person who you can take the opportunity to help. Galatians chapter 5, verse 14, we're taught that we're supposed to love our neighbors. There needs to be this general attitude of well-being towards others within the world. We as Christians, we have this responsibility to love other people, to have this compassion towards them. You know, he talks about, for all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then he talks about how they don't do that. They bite and devour one another. I mean, we talk about the Great Commission. We're supposed to go out and evangelize. And why do we evangelize? Well, because we care about the lost of the world. Well, what about as individual Christians? You come across someone who's not a member of the church, and they're in need. Do you have care? Yeah, I got to teach them the gospel. I care for them. Yeah, but they're in physical need. Are you willing to help them? No, I'm not willing to help them, but I'll talk to them about, no, it doesn't work that way. The compassion that exists for their soul should also exist for their well-being. If you have the opportunity to do that, if you have the means to do that, the love for your neighbor says you do what you can to help them. Over in 1 Corinthians 13, verses 3 through 8. Be turning there for a moment. I'll remind you again, this is where the difficulty comes in. We live in a day and age where there are a lot of lazy individuals. A lot of individuals who choose not to work. A lot of individuals who put themselves in that case. But yet there's a lot of people who genuinely need help. And we have to exercise the judgment and the wisdom. Sometimes it's better to err on the side of caution. Sometimes you may end up helping someone you probably shouldn't have. But it'd be better to do that than to say no to someone who genuinely you should help. I'll give you a case in point, not by name or anything like that. But being here at the building, because we are a religious institution, we'll have people stop by from time to time. You know, and they'll knock on the door and they'll want money for this, they'll want money for that. I had this one fella, and he has stopped by probably half a dozen times over the last 11 years. Every so often he'll come by again, tells me what his occupation used to be, tells me about his story. One time he came by, and in a couple of days he was going to get something like $53,000, but he just needed a couple hundred to get him by for a couple of days, you know. And the last time he came through, he was supposed to have his lung removed the next day, and his wife was in the car with him. And he was telling me the story, and I was having a hard time believing it. And she kind of was verifying it from where she was at. And so he brought out this coin, and he had stapled it like a little two McDonald lids, or the clear lids there. And he says, coin is worth $200, $300, maybe $1,200. If you just give me $200, I'll let you have the coin. Now, I'd done some research into coins, and I wasn't going to be that lucky. And more than likely, if I gave him $250, I'd go down and maybe get 12 for the coin and what it was stolen. And every time the guy has come by, I ask myself, and I've helped him in the past, and that's why I'm reluctant now, because nothing ever changes. The story changes. It's always something different. He'll come by again, and I'm going to remember to say, hey, how'd the surgery go? You living with one lung okay? Now, if he shows me he actually did, here's the hospital, I'll feel really bad about that. But you have to figure out. Sometimes you'll help the right person, sometimes you'll help the wrong person. But you've got to be willing to help and exercise wisdom in so doing. There's got to be this compassion. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We helped an individual a long time ago. This is where you kind of get burned a little bit. This guy, his name was John. We lived in McAllister. And about the same thing, about every 4 or 5 months, he'd come a calling. And so when we didn't have the money, put him in a motel one night, gave him money for food one time. And this probably went on. And there was one night I had to even arrange the next day for him to work for somebody. And so I put him at a motel that night so he could go work for this fella and earn some money. He didn't do it. So the last time he called, met him at the motel, gave him $3 to buy a hamburger. Rhonda saw him walk across to the convenience store while I was still inside and coming out. He came back with liquor. I don't know what you could buy for $3, but he got something. And so at some point you want to say to yourself, this ain't worth it. Everybody I seem to help seems to be unworthy of it. But you can't get that way. I think Jack told me the story of a time a fella he offered, hey, come work on my farm. I'll give you $10 an hour, wasn't it? Might have been Jack. The guy says, man, I can stand here and make $20 an hour panhandling. But not everybody's that way. Not every situation is that way. So you got to have the compassion so when the moment is as it is true, then you are willing to step forward and help all that you possibly can. Just learn to be wise in that. 1 Corinthians 13. This is the principle, beginning of verse 3. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, Paul says it profits me nothing. He says love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. This is the love that we're supposed to have. And as individual Christians, this love will take us through every situation, and in every opportunity we possibly can, we are there to help. One more passage, and then we'll move on to a congregational application of a willingness to help. Here, James, in James chapter 1, and we need to think about the willingness here again seen as we think about our lives as Christians. He says in James 1:27, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. This is our individual charge as Christians. During the culture in which they lived, if you found yourself a widow with children, you were hard-pressed. Think about the story of Naomi and Ruth. Now, we live in a culture today that there's a lot more programs in place, but you know, as individual Christians, if you know of a widow that is in need, if you know of children who are in need, you have a responsibility, if you can, to step forward, to do your part, to remember them. And I really think James is talking about the local area, not necessarily trying to find others 2,000 miles away to help. You can do that if you want to. But it's even more important if you've got those amongst the congregation, those around. The willingness there must be present to help. But now what about the congregational application of this? As individual Christians, we can do whatever we would like to do in trying to help other people. Congregation has responsibilities as well. Go back to Acts chapter 4 real quick. We see that at the very beginning, there was a responsibility of brethren to help brethren. Starting there in verse 32 of chapter 4, Acts 4 verse 32. He says, now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. So about the Christians here, all those who had obeyed the gospel on the day of Pentecost, those who had obeyed in chapter 3 as well, they're all hanging around Jerusalem. They're all staying around. They're learning. They're growing. The problem is there's not enough to provide for them. And this isn't some sort of situation established so that we might take care of all the poor and needy of Jerusalem. This was a scenario where you had Jews that had traveled from their homes to Pentecost with the intention of going back. They didn't go back. They became Christians. And they stayed and stayed and stayed and stayed. They left their homes and their jobs behind. And so there was this great need amongst them. I mean, imagine if you had a pilgrimage of 3,000 people to come in and say, we don't want to go home, we want to stay and continue to learn. How do you provide for them? Well, the Christians who had sold what they had so that it could be distributed, so that others would have what they needed within this wonderful group of people. Now, eventually, starting of Stephen, they were dispersed, Acts chapter 8. And they left, they scattered everywhere preaching the word. They went back to their home. But continuing, and with great power the apostle gave witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them, nor was there anyone among them who lacked. In verse 34, for all who were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the proceeds of the things that were sold, and laid them at the apostles' feet. And they distributed to each as anyone had need. And it goes on and talks more examples of that. And so we have the case in point where the brethren recognize the needs of fellow brethren, and they step up to help them. In Acts chapter 11, Agabus foretold the coming of a famine throughout the region of Judea. So the saints there in Antioch, the disciples there, they laid by in store. And they had that money. It was sent by the hands that they were, the ones that they chose, and they sent it up to Jerusalem and to the elders there up within that area. So when the famine came, they would have what they need. Brethren stepping forward to help the brethren. Paul commends the church in Corinth in 2 Corinthians 9 for their willingness not just to help, but to go above and beyond. Notice again, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, we start there in verse 6. But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver, and God is able to make all grace abound towards you. He's talking about here in the case in point, Paul was traveling around taking up the collection from congregations, carrying it to Jerusalem for the saints who were in need. The brethren in Corinth, he's encouraging them to be ready for this. One more passage looking at the congregational application. I talked about widows a while ago. Who would take care of the widows during the first century, where you didn't have the governmental programs and retirements and Social Security and so forth? Well, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, beginning there in verse 3, the local congregation did, under a couple of very specific conditions there. He says, honor widows who are really widows. Here's what he means by that. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. So if you had a widow, someone whose husband has died, Paul says, let the children take care of her. Let the grandchildren take care of her. That's where it needs to begin first. Let them show honor to her. This is good and acceptable. Now, she who is really a widow and left alone, trusts in God and continues in supplication and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives, and these things command that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So if you have a widow who has family at home, they better take care of her. That's their responsibility to help provide for their family. So verse 9, do not let a widow under 60 years be taken into the number, that is, to those who the church will help take care of, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good words. If she's brought up children, if she's lodged strangers, if she's washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work, those are the ones the church can take care of. Help to provide for. Help to make certain that they have means to live. Refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry. In other words, let them go marry. Let them find someone to take care of them. They're still young. They can do that. Verse 14, therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house. Give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. Verse 16, if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them. And do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. So when I talk about the difference between individual application and congregational application, here's a big one right here. There were cases in point where you had widows that the church could not help whatsoever because they had family members that needed to take care of them. But then you had godly women who were widows and had no one to take care of them. Then the church collectively could step forward to do that. But in order to bring all of this about, there's got to be the willingness. There's got to be the willingness to step up and not a selfish type attitude, not a stingy type attitude, but a willingness that says if there's a need, it's a genuine need, then we can do it, or I can do it. But we have to recognize that it begins with an understanding of what Christ did for us, what God did for us. Christ came and died upon the cross of Calvary. He gave his life for us. So what is it that he asks of us if from time to time we have a responsibility and an opportunity to help someone who is in need? As individual Christians, we carry that responsibility. And collectively, we carry the responsibility. But it all first begins with a willingness to do as God has done for us and to help those who are in need. So think about that in your life as a Christian. You come across individuals who are in need, have the willingness, if you have the means, to be able to do what you can. But more importantly now, if you are not a Christian, you need to become one. You need to obey the gospel's call into salvation. As we said, look what God did so that you could be saved. It's there, right there. The call is there, waiting for you to answer it. If you believe that Christ is the Son of God, then make the decision to turn away from sin, to confess your faith before those who are present, and obey his command, be baptized. You rise up then to walk in the newness of life. All your past sins have been washed away by the blood of the Lamb. Now, let's go share with others both the message and share in the willingness to help them as God has helped you. But if you are a Christian, you've not been living faithfully. Maybe this is an area where Satan has gotten kind of a foothold within your life. Let's rethink about what God has done for you and develop an appreciation for that and then a love for others. And then you'll find that you'll be able to return back to fellowship with God. If you're subject to the gospel's call and invitation, come forward now as we stand and as we sing.